So when you guys were in high school, think back a little bit of time. Anthony, you're younger than us, so you don't gotta go quite as far back. But think back a little bit when you and your friends hung out. Like, what was your like go-to hangout things? Like, what did you do when you were gonna go hang out with your friends?
Man,
you're able to drive. I'll say it that way.
Not anything super exciting. I joked about it on Sunday about how like we would literally, there was a gas station nearby, or I said
it was a nice gas station.
It was a nice gas station.
It was a fixed up gas station. I was laughing so hard when you said that.
But we would go there and just kind of hang out, get something to drink, buy those $1 iced teas, the big cans.
Eat some donuts.
Yeah, get some donuts that you thought were free and were not free, and borderline get arrested. But we would go there. We would go to, like, there was a Taco Bell down the road. And so like a lot of times after games, that would be like the meetup place. But if we were over at someone's house, it was never anything crazy. It was a lot of like my friends. It was funny, you texted about euchre. Like I had friends that played cards. I was never super into cards, but I was always very social. So we would just go over, like we had a couple friends that had finished basements, and they were like really fun finished basements. So they had like pool tables, darts. Like one guy had like just a cool movie setup, so we'd watch movies over there. I think he had a ping pong table in the back. So like that type of stuff where it would be social. We would also have a lot of bonfires. So like the classic, when the weather wasn't frigid cold, but in the fall, hang out by the bonfire. So yeah, a lot of just like social hanging out, easy going.
For us, I mean, I think once we started driving, it was either one of two things. They would come over to our house. Like our house was always the house that everyone came to. And we had a Taco Bell at the end of our street. So it was super convenient, but we would play basketball in our backyard a ton. I mean, all like in the summertime, all day long. And then this is crazy to even think about, we would break to go to Taco Bell, and you would eat like, whatever you got from Taco Bell and drink a Mountain Dew and then play basketball.
Go
like
right back to it.
Now it would just wreck me if I tried something like that. The other option is we really liked movies. And so we went to movies a lot. That was a go-to for many years. So like even Mary and I are high school sweethearts. We started dating when I was a freshman. So the first like couple of years of dating, I couldn't drive, but a group of us every Friday night after our sporting events went to a movie. So that was like a big deal. And then once we started dating, go to movies, or my friends would come over to my house. We would rent a movie from Blockbuster to date me a little bit. Yeah. Oh, that was so much fun. Like I still miss it to some degree. Like
going to just look through and see what they have.
I mean, the excitement of getting a new release and like,
because you had to fight for them because they were limited.
Yeah. You were waiting at the door and someone brought one in and you pointed it and they would, check it in and give it to you. And you thought like, oh, I scored, So yeah, that's kind of our jams.
Yeah, Taco Bell is going to be a 3 for 3 on this one.
Man,
so
nice.
we would always go to Taco Bell.
Advertisement.
Yeah. Well, it used to be you go to Taco Bell and for 50 cents a piece you get tacos. Like
I know.
You can eat
they had the
for
59
under like 3 or 4
cents,
bucks.
69 cents, 79 cents.
Yeah.
Maybe even at one time a 49 cents menu. Yeah, so you could eat for a few dollars.
Yeah.
Yep.
So when I was in high school, you paid 75 cents a gallon for gas, and you could get tacos super cheap. So
different times.
Yeah, different times. But yeah, it was the same thing for us. We'd hang out a lot. I had a group of friends that we liked skating, so we did a lot of skating when we hung out together. But other than that, there was a 50-cent movie theater in Canton at the time,
awesome.
So we'd go
And
watch
Movies 10?
movies. Yeah, Movies 10.
Yeah, man.
Yep.
And they changed
Were those movies like out for like a year? Was
Yeah,
it
so
like
they
just
were-
delayed? Yeah.
Not new releases, but they hadn't gone to video. They haven't gone to Blockbuster
Like
yet.
newer
So
releases.
Okay, so this is what this generation doesn't even understand, especially this generation because it's changed. When we were kids, when a movie came out, it came out on video a year later.
Yeah,
Like
it
a
was long
solid
time.
year. Yeah. And I read an article one time when they started doing DVDs, they started making the movie and DVDs at the same time. So that sped it up, but it was still a delayed process because they would allow it to go through the movies. Now, I mean, obviously it's like sometimes at the same time, it's like almost you could like even right now, movies that are out in the theaters, you can rent them on Amazon and pay a premium for them. But yeah, like so there was those theaters because you had that year gap, they would show later or like things that have been released like 6 months ago for 50 cents. For us it was $1, and Mary used to love doing
It
that.
was 50 cents Wednesdays. So like
50
it was
cents
normally
okay,
$1, but
yeah.
50 cent Wednesdays.
And even
so.
their candy was cheaper, which is a funny vibe that they did. Like popcorn and candy was cheaper. And, those are good times.
It was great. I wish they still had those things. So.
I know. And think about it now, to some degree, like I still love movies. I'm a movie guy, TV guy, like watching stuff. Like some of it's been like soured in the sense that there's just too many options.
Yeah.
Do you ever get now where you're just like overwhelmed?
overloaded? Yeah.
And you don't want to waste your time, and so it's hard. Like back then, it was just like you waited for the new release and you went and you got it, and
you spend about as much time looking for something good to watch as you do watching the actual show or movie. Like it feels like I actually have certain nights where I'm like, you know, I'm just going to spend a certain amount of time, and I'm going to click on a bunch of things that I think I'll watch, so that the next time I don't have to do that. I'll just have things to watch, because you know what I mean. Like you can save them on your like watch later list, and so like if I see something that looks good, I'll put it on my watch later list, because like that's my least favorite part. Is there's so many options. It takes me a while to go through them.
My problem is I save my stuff on my watch later list, but then when the next time I go to get on, there's something else that interests me.
Yeah.
And I end up searching for another 45 minutes, and I don't ever get to my watch later list.
That's funny.
Nothing's worse though is when you start a show and you get into it, and two things, like either it just goes lame.
Yeah.
You're like, I invested that time, or this has happened to me a few times. You get really into a show and then you watch it and then they don't renew it.
Yeah.
Yes.
And they just leave you like on a hanger, and you're like,
this wasn't renewed for a third season. You're like, you got to be kidding me.
I hate that.
The worst.
Well, hey, welcome to the Branch Podcast, where I sit down with Pastor Matthew and Pastor Anthony, and we have a conversation about the past week's message, or we'll talk about a theological topic every once in a while. But this week we're going to revisit Pastor Anthony's message and talk a little bit about relationships and why they're important for our lives, and how we can have positive relationships in our lives and the importance of those. So, Anthony, why don't you take just a quick second, just kind of catch everybody up and just revisit the main thrust of your message from this past weekend.
Yeah, so it's within the context of the series, which is life-changing habits. So the first week you talked about how we need to put God first, like that before anything else. That is like the foundational building block. So if you're thinking in terms of habits, this idea this week of purposed relationships, it's I don't know if you really call having relationships a habit. And I kind of joked about that at the beginning of the message. Like everybody has relationships. It's such a fundamental part of our existence as human beings. But it's a different thing to have purposed relationships in the sense of you're thinking about who you're hanging around, you're thinking about how they're influencing you. And so one of the things that I just brought up, even, kind of comically talking about the teenage years, I think we all understand that idea of like teenagers are easily influenced by peer pressure. You kind of have the stereotypical narrative with that. Mm-hmm. We all understand that. We've all been teenagers. You have teenagers now. You guys, you understand that. But I think what people don't realize is even in our adult years, the people that we associate with really do influence us. Like the things that they value and talk about, the conversations that we have, the priorities of their lives, all of those things have bearing on our own lives. And so it was just this idea that while relationships are essential and it's something we all desire, it's important that we also realize relationships are a powerful influence, a powerful force of impact in our lives, whether for good or for bad. And so the idea that none of our relationships are neutral, right? And I basically said either the person you're in relationship with is a follower of Jesus, or they're not. Like those are the only two categories. And so either they're going to be a person that is going to influence you for the good of your faith, right? They're going to encourage your walk with Christ. They're going to deepen your faith. They're going to challenge you. They're going to encourage you. They're going to walk next to you in that journey. Or they're going to be a person that either directly or indirectly influences you in such a way that pulls you away from your faith, or potentially just distracts you to focus on temporal things or things that ultimately are not about the kingdom of God. And so the three main points that I talked about is that we need to find friends that are pursuing God. We need to find friends that are actually actively helping us grow. There's a level of intentionality in that friendship, and also friends that are willing to speak the truth. And how oftentimes it's easy to surround ourselves with people that tell us the things that we want to hear and kind of go along with us, but it's a lot harder to have friends that are willing to speak the truth. And it's hard for us oftentimes, I think, to receive the hard truths that we don't always want to hear. And so sometimes we surround ourselves with friends that don't do that. And so being purposeful in giving people the permission to do that, but also pursuing those types of relationships. And then I would just say, lastly, also thinking in terms of who we are in our relationships. And so how are we influencing our friends? So the people that God has placed in our lives, even thinking in terms of non-believers, God has placed us in the lives of non-believers, whether in our workplaces or wherever it might be, and thinking about how God might be giving us opportunities to influence them for the good of his kingdom, right? To influence them in the way of Christ. And so to even just think intentionally in those terms as well.
Sure. So I want to start by just thinking through and talking through the idea of even the need to have this conversation. I would say that we, particularly as Americans, I would say we think that we're not as influenced as we probably are. why is it important for us to understand that other relationships, people, and I know we're not talking about like other sources, we're just talking about relationships right now, but that we are gullible. Gullible is not the right word, but culpable, susceptible. Yeah, that's the better word. Susceptible to being influenced by other people.
I mean, I think at a baseline level, what I was even trying to establish early on in the message is that we are relational creatures. We're social creatures. And so if you take that even at face value, it means one of the ways that God has created us and designed us to thrive and flourish is in the sense of we belong to a people. We belong to community. The question is, who is that community? What are they like? What are they about? Every community has certain values, right? So like we talk about in terms of culture, but even culture, like we say the culture as a whole, even within that there's subcultures, right? If you grew up in a Hispanic household, you might have certain cultural values that are different from someone who grew up in an African-American household or a white household. Like you could break it down to all kinds of different levels. And I say that to say the friend groups and relationships, the people that we surround ourselves with all have these collective values. And so I think we are naive to believe that when we find ourselves in that those social settings as social creatures, to think that those cultural values aren't going to somehow have an impact to influence our lives on the things that we value and the things that we're prioritizing. If everybody around us, if the people that are most important to us are valuing certain things, in this case, things that might be opposed to the kingdom of God and opposed to the values of God, it's foolish to think that over time, those things aren't going to take root in our own hearts and our own lives, to where the things that we're now valuing, the things that we're talking about and the things that we're thinking about aren't being shaped by those things when our relationships are so fundamentally important to who God has created us to be.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, all of us are influenced. And I think if anyone, we were using the term susceptible, we use the term initially gullible, but I think both of those are fitting. We are all influenced in some capacity, and every single influence comes from a person. So even if we would say like an organization is influencing us, there's still a person behind the organization. Right. So there's no influence in our life that is not relational. Yeah. And so I think there are times that at best I would say it's naive to think you're not being influenced by people. But I would say at worst, it's arrogant to think like somehow I'm able to be so self-sustaining in my perfect knowledge in my head that I'm not influenced is ridiculous, because all of us, all you have to do is look at ourselves for a second and realize in some capacity, I am operating in a way that's been influenced by someone else. All of us are wearing clothes designed by someone else. Exactly. And it all is still, even in our culture that allows there to be so many different types of fashion, it's still uniquely American or even European fashion. Like we don't look like how people would dress in a Middle Eastern country or even an African country. And so like your influence in how you dress, your influence in the way you think and talk and what you find funny. And I mean, so like every single aspect of your life is being influenced. Right. This is why it's so important. You have to choose how you're going to be influenced. And that's the part of it is if you walk around in arrogance or being naive and thinking like, no, I can float above it, then you're just being influenced out of your control. And there's no wisdom behind it. And so, I think we have to just go, influence is not a bad thing. That's not saying you're weak. It's just saying like, it is what it is. You're influenced. So now are you going to be purposed? And that's what the series is about is being purposed to say, okay, I want to choose what influences me the most. There are some things we just can't choose. We are raised in an American culture. You're going to be influenced without your even knowing it fully. But the things that you can choose are the things that can have not just an impact on your life now, but an eternal impact. It really can. But it impacts stuff now. So like even in his analogy or his story where he had a gentleman speak into his life about his marriage, what a lasting effect that influence had to make his marriage better. And I was blessed to have the same thing. I had a gentleman that was a mentor to me growing up, Christopher Flanagan, and just wonderful. He's one of my junior high leaders and then was an elder at our church, just a great guy, still a friend of mine. And he was the one that influenced me on how to be a husband. Just early on, just like, you are going to be a good husband. You're going to enjoy marriage. You got to love your wife well. I mean, those were influences that just spoke into my mind and heart and gave me confidence where I wouldn't have had before. So again, it's about choosing who is going to influence you so that you can have the desired result.
So how do you set those values from the start? Like what are the things that, because you said there's things that we can choose that influence and things we don't. How do we set those priorities and those values in our lives?
Well, I think it goes even to the first point of my message, which is finding people that are pursuing the Lord, right? Like, yes, we might all have minor disagreements and different opinions on varying topics, but for the most part, I mean, even if you take the three of us, I think there's going to be far more agreement about the way that we live our lives and things that we think are important and prioritizing in our lives than disagreement, right? And I would say, while we've all had different upbringings and experiences throughout our lives, that's because of our faith, like the common faith that we hold, and ultimately the Bible that we believe that guides and shapes our faith. So many of our values are derived from that, right? And so we've talked in many podcasts before, the culture that we live in, and again, the many subcultures that come with it, there's always this kind of ever revolving door, right? It's always changing. What mattered and what was important 50 years ago is different than today. And even what was considered taboo then is different than what is considered taboo today. Like it's just totally different. So that landscape is always changing, where I would say there are certain values and things that we think are unchanging, right? These unchanging truths that come from God's word that dictate how we treat one another, how we view other human beings, how we should operate. Sure, there's some liberty within that, but I think that's the most important thing is to find other people that is the big rock in their lives, in the sense of they're pursuing hard after the Lord. They're wanting to live in such a way that honors God. And I said this Sunday, that doesn't mean you're looking for perfect people to be your friends, people who don't make mistakes, people who have got everything figured out and they don't have any questions, but it's finding people that are on the same trajectory that you're on in life. Because otherwise you're going to find, like, the reality is all of us have a worldview. That's what I think. I don't think people realize that. All of us have a worldview. So if I were to sit with a room of 100 people and ask each of them what they thought about various topics, like, what does money mean to you? What do you think about sex? What do you think about XYZ? I mean, fill in the blank. As people respond, they're going to start to show you what matters to them, what beliefs they have, their belief systems, where they derive those beliefs. If I were to ask you, okay, what do you believe? And then why do you believe that? You would start to see that. So all of us have a worldview. All of us have a value system. So it goes back to starting with, where do we derive that as Christ followers? Well, it comes from God himself. God has shown us, and Christ is not only our Savior and Lord, but he's our model and our example. And if we're going to be influenced, we need to be influenced by people who have submitted their lives to Christ first and foremost.
Yeah, I'll take it even a step further back and say I 100% agree with them, but I would say it has to begin with the end result in mind. So when we're thinking about it, we have to think, what do we want our lives to look like? And I think that's a big piece that I think a lot of people miss, because they don't give any thought to it. They basically live their life just going with the flow, and there's just a lot of like open-ended. If it's fun, do it. If it makes you feel good, do it. But I think when you take a step back and say, okay, this is ultimately where I want my life to look like, then it's at that point you can start to decide and define what influences you're going to allow in your life in order to get you there. So like each one of us have different hobbies. So you love like endurance type racing and things like that. Well, once you determine as an endurance runner what you want the end to be. So if it's a marathon or it's a one of your crazy races that you do, 30-mile, 50-mile races, well, then you're going to choose who's going to influence, right?
Right.
Like, I don't say this in any way disrespectful. You're not going to come to me and ask me my opinion on a 50-mile race because I have no idea. I've never done that.
Sure.
You're going to read and watch videos of a person who's mastered that. And so, like, again, any of our hobbies, any of the things, like last week, I had to replace something on a snowblower, a carburetor, which I've never felt more masculine than that moment doing it. But I went to a YouTube video, found the specific snowblower that I have, found a guy who took it apart, or one similar to mine, watched it because he has a channel, and I actually looked, he had 500,000 followers, and I'm like, this is a guy that knows what he's talking about because 500,000 people are following him. I watched his video. I'm not going to go to someone that's never done it before and go, what's your thoughts on how to replace this?
What's your opinion about this?
Isn't that how most people live their lives?
Yeah.
They go to a friend who's never mastered what they're wanting, and they go like, well, give me your advice on a decision. And it's just foolishness. So you want to find some godly influence, because that person's basing their life on the word of God, which has lasted for thousands of years and will continue to last, and is based on a relationship with a living God. And so, like, once you determine, I want my life to be here in a place that honors God, then you start to pick those people that are living that life that shows it. Again, not perfection. And I love that he highlighted that we're not talking about perfection because none of us are perfect, but there are people who have made that their passion. And honestly, that's who you want to follow, even in their imperfections. Because in their imperfections, they'll run back to Christ for grace and they'll acknowledge it. And then they'll learn from their failures and mistakes, and they'll be able to give you wisdom on that so you don't have to experience the same things. I mean, the people that have influenced me the most, a lot of that influence comes from their failure. They'll tell you, I made this mistake when I was at this age and I did this thing. And so, yeah, that's my advice.
I was going to say, I think it's important and amazing that you guys keep bringing it back to the values. One of the things that you'll see oftentimes is people wear the label of Christian without actually sharing the same values. So you can have somebody who says they're a Christian and they can say, well, you don't have to follow what God says there. You know,
right?
And I'm trying to think of an example off the top of my head. But
well, you see it all the time in our culture, though. I mean, people will say like, "Yeah, I'm a Christian, and I'm living with my boyfriend or girlfriend.
Yeah,
I'm a Christian, and I don't need to go to church." Yeah, like he said on Sunday, he's like, "I love you, but you're wrong." Yeah, and I love that line because it's like, yeah. So sorry to interrupt you.
No. It's that, but that's exactly where I was going with it. Is this? We have to start from the values, and do the values match Christ's value, whether what your friend is telling you is a Christian or not, because all of us make mistakes at times and we're all not perfect in leading the way of that. So do the values that you see in Jesus match up with what with the direction that you want to go, and are the relationships pointing you to that direction? So 100%. I just think that's an important thing.
And then follow it, because like, here's a perfect example. So this is my ignorance and or arrogance. This past year I set out to run a marathon. And I did what I typically did. I Googled it, found a plan, and then ignored it. Right? Like, I looked at the plan and I thought, okay, there's some things I can draw from it. Literally, this is what I did. Literally, I looked at it, evaluated it, and improved it in my mind of how I could accelerate it to get to the place I needed to be. I've never run a marathon before, and I am critiquing and changing a plan by a professional runner who has run marathons. And what happened? I got injured. I got injured like 3/4 of the way in and couldn't do it. So I have to do it this year. And again, I thought, man, if there's ever a perfect example of what we do is in our culture, we look at lives of people who are running toward Christ. We look at the standard of God and we go, I can do it better. I can do it different. And then what happens? We get hurt in the process. So when you find those people, you can't pick and choose. You find the people that have wisdom, that are based on the word of God, and you surrender your life to that.
We talked about this idea very early on in this conversation, but I want to get back to this place where we have to come to the place where we realize that we're not in a static place. So we're constantly being shaped somewhere. So how do we, with that in mind, if we're always going a certain direction, how do we ensure that, how do we evaluate the friends that we have? And, well, I guess this is kind of the same question that I just asked you, but it really is looking like, how do we ensure that we are finding people that are taking us in the right direction? And how do we avoid or deal with someone who might not be leading us in the right direction? I think that's the question I want to go with there.
I mean, I wouldn't have a lot to add to this, but I think what you, Matthew, just talked about a few short minutes ago, like the idea of defining the win for your life, right? If you don't have a vision for your life and what you're hoping to see happen. So I talked a little bit about this on Sunday in the sense of, we need people to speak to the blind spots in our lives. So like one thing would be like coming to the acknowledgement, okay, I don't have it all figured out, right? Like there's area for me to grow as a husband, as a father, as a pastor. Okay, so what does that mean then? Then I need to find other people who can speak into my lives or into my life that are living in such a way that's going to not only be a picture of that, but they're going to be able to speak specifically into those areas. But that starts with having some sort of vision for my own life, right? Because it's like, how can you hit the target if you haven't defined the target? And I do think that is a major problem for most of us, is particularly when it comes to relationships. And I mentioned this, it might be the people that share the same hobby or sports teams, or just a lot of times it's very superficial things, right? It's just kind of who we fall into. So much of our lives are accidental. And so I think we're not going to be able to have any sort of filter until we define who it is that we want to be and the life that we want to live. because until you do that, you're not going to be able to even discern, okay, this is a person who's living completely opposed to the life that I want to live,
Sure.
right? If I'm friends with a person who is, and I want to be a more faithful husband, I probably don't want to be friends with a dude who's a womanizer, right? Who's running around and has never been consistent or committed in his life. Like, that's probably not the person that I want to go to have a model for faithfulness in marriage, right? And so you can use that example at any different level.
Yeah.
If I want to grow in someone who's being as a person who's disciplined, I'm not going to go to the person who's super indulgent and lazy and always cutting corners. So again, I think it starts with having a vision for your life. Now, I would say that vision, going back to what the Bible says, our vision is modeled after the life of Jesus, right? We are trying as Christians to become like Jesus. And so that has to dictate the vision that we have for our lives. And therefore, once we have that, have the target, if you will, then it's going to be much easier to discern the people I'm hanging out with. Are they people that are pushing me in that direction to help me become the person I want to be? Or are they people that embody values that are opposed to or even distracting to the life that I know God is calling me into?
So as we think about this idea, typically the Bible calls it being unequally yoked. How do we handle the situations when we recognize, we might be going in different directions? How do you handle a relationship at that point?
So I think in my life, because I was thinking about this idea even when Anthony was teaching, and I was processing my own life. When I think about it, I think every single relationship in my life, I feel a responsibility to be an influencer in the relationship. So every single relationship. So like even like you two are solid believers, pastors in our church. And when you hear this, you won't feel this as condescending. I think in our relationship, I want to influence you, but in the exact same sense, I know that every relationship is going to influence me. And so I want to pick and choose what it is because it's not about being perfect. So, but I might look at some characteristic that you have that's admirable that I want to grow in and learn. So like you really do carry yourself in a very, very humble way. There's a gentleness about you. I desire that. That's one of the things I've even shared from the front. Like if there's one area that I want to grow in as a fruit of the Spirit, it is in gentleness because I was not raised in a gentle home. I am not by nature gentle. And so like, it doesn't feel aggressive to me. We've talked about this. I think your family was similar. So like Anthony and I could probably have a conversation and neither of us feel like it was not gentle, but someone listening might go like, yeah, that was rough. Right. But so my wife who is gentle, I want to be gentle. So I might look at your life and go, how does Chris speak? How does Chris act? Anthony is incredibly intentional about his relationships in the way that he invests in people's lives, very welcoming. Him and his wife, Makira, is the same way. Like, I just hear through the grapevine, connecting with people, loving people that way. And I always want to grow in that area. So I might draw from that. So like in my life, it's not about judging people in a sense of trying to disqualify them, but you can look at their lives and pull where you can learn from, but also knowing I need to be influencing them toward Christ. When you find a relationship where you can't draw anything from it and that person actually has the potential to pull you away, that's when you have to check it and say, okay, this might be a relationship where the phrase unequally yoked. Now, I'll explain it real quick because I don't think you didn't explain the term, or did you?
What's funny is I think I explained it the first service and then I forgot in the second because I don't think I had it in my notes. It was just like one of those things I was going to explain on the fly, and I don't think I did the second service.
The service I listened to because I was out of town was you didn't explain it, but they would literally just put a yoke, a wooden connecting device on two oxen. And if one of them was bigger and stronger, that one would dominate and pull, and you would go crooked because they're not equally pulling in the same direction. Yeah. So it's the same thing relationally. If someone is not spiritually going in the direction as you, you're going to go crooked. You're not going to go in the straight line. And you have to have a sensitivity to recognize that there are fruit of their life that's not pleasing to God, and for whatever reason, it's crossing over where you're no longer being the primary influencer, you're being influenced, and it's pulling you away. And I've had relationships in my life that were that. My friends in high school, when I graduated high school, I couldn't hang out with that group. I had lost the ability to influence them, but I was being influenced by them. So like, even though I was in Bible college, when I hung out with them, I found myself being more foul in how I communicated, more negative, less Christ-like. And so I just had to make a decision to break those relationships and develop new ones because I was getting pulled away. And so that's what you have to do is recognize, like, if they are influencing you more than you can influence them, That's a tough call, but you got to do it.
I think that's so perfect. I actually had two girls come up. They were friends, and one of them was struggling, and they were asking me some questions after the message. And that was one of the things that came up, because I think this is hard. It's a tightrope walk for people, because one of the things that I kind of tagged on the end of the message there is I wanted it to be clear to people, like, this isn't, we're not becoming monastics and cutting ourselves off from the world. Like, the message is not that you don't want to interact with non-Christians, because then we're missing out on such a large part of God's calling on our lives to be missional and to focus on what it means to embody Christ and to show Christ to the world that so desperately needs him. But I said almost the same thing that you said. It's so important to understand, like, if you can be friends with a person where you're influencing them for good without them tempting you or distracting you or in some way negatively affecting you in your walk with Christ, then it's okay. The moment that they start to negatively impact you, whether that be you personally, your mental health, your spiritual walk with God, your marriage, whatever it might be, when they're starting to impact you negatively, that is a place where you need to begin to separate yourself. And I think that is an important way that we need to make those distinctions, because I think there are a lot of people that have those friendships and there are varying levels of influence with how they negatively impact their lives.
Right. And I would say the access you give them to your life matters and should be different based on the relationship. So the truth of it is, I can be in relationship with people who are wildly not living for God because I'm a pastor and I know I'm trying to influence them, but I'm not going out to a bar with them.
Yeah.
Right. I'm not probably taking vacations with them. I'm not investing on that level. It's probably going to be more of a, like, I'll grab a bite to eat with you. I'll talk with you. You can stop by and we'll hang out at the church. We'll talk, or, like, there's a level to it that I'm not going to be the person that's buddy with you. Honestly, if you're wildly not living for God, I'm not allowing you into the inner workings of my heart and mind. I'm not talking to you about my marriage. I'm not talking to you about my struggles, because that's not going to be the depth of our relationship. You are someone that I want to influence because I love you. You're not a project in the sense of a notch on the belt, or I can brag about it, but I am called to love you toward Christ. But you're part of my mission. You're part of that purpose, versus, like, you two who are close personal friends of mine. It's a completely different dynamic because there's a safety in opening my mind and heart. I can go on vacation with you and your families. I can hang out with you. Well, we'll go to dinner. We'll go see movies together. Yeah. It's a completely different dynamic because we're not unequally yoked.
Sure.
Us as friends are going in the same direction.
I think too, like, having more than one relationship in your life that is able to help you kind of navigate that process.
Oh yeah.
Some of the things you say, like, I think can get tricky. To gauge on our own, like, when are we crossing that line? When has it become something from where we were influencing somebody to we are being influenced by them? And so that's why I think it's important to be in a community and have multiple people in our lives that can do what you said, Anthony, speak into our lives and help us navigate. Are we being influenced by, or are we influencing people that are going in different direction than we're going?
Yeah.
So,
and you have to, Anthony said it in his message, you have to give people permission to do that. You have to, like, invite them into it, because the average person is just not going to do that. Like, I'm a Enneagram 8. I know some people love or hate the Enneagram, but I'm a strong personality. I think you and I had a conversation about this, maybe even this week, where we're talking about we're wired in such a way that we're going to stand up to people. We're going to confront people naturally, not in the sense that we're jerks or argumentative, but we just have, like, a strength of will, or I don't know how to word it. But the average person is just simply not that way. It's harder for the average person. So if you don't invite them into your life to speak into your life, then I just don't think they're going to do it. And you have to be intentional about it. I mean, like, you've been a part of enough meetings with me where I've done it, where I've said to the elders and to the pastors, and you've been a part of some meetings too, where I'm like, I'm struggling in this area. In this season, I've had seasons where I'm like, I don't feel like I've been a good husband. I feel like in this season, I've been short-tempered. I've been selfish. I haven't been gentle. I've had that where I've talked to the elders. I've had bad meetings where I feel like, man, I did not represent Christ well in that. And you have to invite people to then speak into your life, to hold you accountable, to follow up and check. And once you build that rhythm, then it's an open invitation. If in the future you see something in my life that is dangerous or not pleasing to God, please address it. And so I know, like, Phil Vendrick's another one that He consistently, Phil is by far the most encouraging person in my life, like by far. I mean, he, like, no knock on anyone else, but Phil, like, just about every day will text me encouragement. But he also will be a person that will say to me, "You seem off," and that's his gentle way of saying, like, you're seeming short, like you're impatient. There's something that's just off in your body language, and I appreciate it because there's a safety there. He's not trying to shame me or hurt me. But we have built that relationship through encouragement and connection that he feels safe enough that, I mean, I'm his boss on one level, but he's not talking to me as his boss. He's talking to me as his friend. But again, you have to invite that into it. If you never invite anyone into it, then the only person who will is going to be someone that's really, really strong personality. And chances are, if you don't invite them, you're going to be put off by them speaking into your life, and you're going to think they're the jerk.
And I was just going to say, even if you do invite them, I think you have to mentally and emotionally prepare yourself, because regardless of who you are, regardless of how lofty your ideals are and how much you want to grow, none of us like to be told that we're wrong. I mean, it's the story that I shared, like, even in that moment of Tom, like, speaking to me, it really was like the sting of embarrassment. Like, I felt ashamed in that moment of like, oh man, I blew it. But I knew the posture he was coming from was one of love, and I had asked him to do this for us. And so it was like, what am I going to turn around and be mad? You know, like, number one, I knew it was true. And then number two, it was like, I asked him to do this. So I think it's important that people understand that too. It's not only that you have to go to people and give them that permission. So I was so encouraged. I heard some feedback from Sunday that a bunch of people were texting other people, which was great. Like, so they were doing what I told them. Like, it was like, hey, you know,
they were breaking relationships off, like, in the middle of service.
That type of, although people did joke about that, like, I need to text someone and but people were texting
during service, was just confronting people. Hey,
no, not that. No, people were texting people the encouraging part of like, hey, I have not done a great job of like being a good friend in this way, like that type of thing. Can we do that again? Can we start meeting that type of thing? But I think it's important for people to realize it's not only that, but it's also preparing yourself, because if you give someone permission and they're a person who's going to take you up on that for your good, it is going to sting. No matter how you prepare yourself, it's going to sting. But I think if you don't respond appropriately, you're immediately going to shut off that relationship from even having that 100%. As being a part of it. And so how you respond is also very important.
I was going to say, because if that person, like you said, if the average person isn't accustomed to having that sort of confrontation, and now they've been pushed back against in that scenario, you can pretty much guarantee it's not going to happen again.
For sure.
Or anymore. You know what I mean?
So I've never once been corrected and enjoyed it in the moment. Yeah. Not a single time. Because there is, like you said your face got red. That's like your adrenaline spiking 100% of the time. Yeah. If someone tells me I'm wrong, if someone confronts me on something that I didn't know was coming, like if you're an idiot and you know you're an idiot, and the person's coming to tell you're an idiot, you're right. Yeah, my bad. You know, but when it's a surprise, it's 100% of the time your adrenaline kicks in, your mind almost becomes defensive. At times, you can even in your mind attack the other person. Who are they to tell me that? And they're this, you know. But that's why you're right, because if you don't respond in the proper way, then you are guaranteeing it's never going to happen again. And we talk about this in leadership so we have a culture of critique. We tell people you have to mentally prepare yourself that in meetings, people are going to critique, because the moment you buck up to them, they now know in order to talk to you, they have to buck up even more. And most people go, nope, not worth it, because I don't want to fight you. I don't want to argue. So like you have to create a culture where it's okay to speak, it's okay to critique, it's okay to push back. And if you do that, then you'll get really honest feedback. And the thing I've learned, even sometimes people could give feedback and it might not be 100% accurate, but there's something in it that's truthful, that if you have a humble heart, will push you in the right direction. Does that make sense? 100%. And so like you'll go, okay, I can learn from that. I can see what you're saying. I can see the heart that you're delivering it. And you can grow from that.
How do you process through? So let's just say like you disagree. Like they come and they push back again. They bring something to you and you're like, hey, I think I see this in your life, such and such. How do you handle the disagreement process and working through that?
Yeah, that's very fair. That's a great question. And I would say always begin in humility of saying, like, even if you say, I don't see what you are saying, but I want to process it. I want to take it in. I want to think about it. Here's what I would encourage you. If someone says something to you and you just don't agree, you don't see it, say, okay, I'm going to pray about this and genuinely do, but I'm also going to discuss this with other people, because I want to see if this is something that I'm just missing out on. Okay, so like here's where it's happened to me. I'll give an example. I'm gonna keep it vague enough, but specific enough. I've had that happen in the past where someone has said something to me, and I'll actually tell my wife about it. And as I'm telling my wife about it, thinking she's going to defend me, like, can you believe this person said it? You guys know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
And your wife's body language is such that you go, oh.
It's true.
It's true, right? And I've had that in other relationships. Or I've just gone to someone and said, someone has said this about me. I don't see it, but am I missing something? And when you say it in that humble way and someone goes, it's true. I see it.
Yeah.
And this has happened with me because my body language in meetings, this is years ago, my body language because I'm not gentle by nature, in meetings was coming across as aggressive. And so like someone had told me that, and I said, what are you talking about? Like, I feel like I create a really safe environment and stuff. And so I asked another employee and they were like, no, I get it. I sense that at times too. And when you come across and you looked a certain way, they were telling me, and I was like, okay, I see what you're saying. That's not my heart, but I see what you're saying. So I could grow from it. You know what I mean? But I think, okay, so let's say you go and talk to someone and they're like, no, I don't see that at all. Then I think it's okay to say to that person, thank you for giving me that. I'm going to just put that in my mind and heart, and I'm going to allow the Holy Spirit to show me if there's truth to that, and have a humility about it. I don't think it needs to be an argument, because sometimes someone is just sharing their perspective.
Yeah.
And there's value to that, because to them that perspective is reality. And then if it's just completely false, just take it for what you can learn from it and then move on. I had an email this week where someone was criticizing me, and they're wrong. So as anyone's trying to guess, don't try to guess it. There's nothing specific that you need to know about it, but they're wrong on this situation, because they don't know all the facts of a situation.
Right.
They're not criticizing something specific I did. I'm just saying they're criticizing a choice or a decision that I made. And I'm like, you just don't know all the facts. I don't have to be offended by it.
Right.
I don't even need to correct them on it. I'm just like, okay, thanks for your email. You know, but yeah.
Yeah, I think, I mean, you say this all the time, like the posture of I could be wrong.
Right.
The flip side of that is have the posture of they could be right.
Yeah, right.
You know, like, because I think what happens is there is something built into us that we go into immediate defensive mode. Like, like you said, our brains immediately start to come up with ways to rationalize or to argue why they're wrong and because of this, and you're not considering this or whatever it is. And so even just starting with a posture of humility, it says, like, there could be something that they're right about here. Even if it's not 100%, even if there's some things that they don't understand, maybe there's something that I need to consider, because we do have blind spots. I mean, that was something I said on Sunday. We all have to be able to acknowledge. I mean, even by nature, calling it a blind spot means we can't see it, or we can't see it very clearly. Yeah. And so I think it's important that we don't immediately react. Like, our natural reaction is to defend. And I've had some people in my life that, to be honest, I see where it comes from. People, particularly who struggle with deep insecurity, are usually the ones that are the most defensive. Because they can't allow someone's critique to kind of enter the illusion that they have of themselves, right? It's almost like it's too heavy a weight to bear. If I were to struggle with this or admit that I struggle with this, then it would demolish my self-confidence and who I am as a person. And so I think the sad part about that is you see the consequence of not correcting those issues, right? You address something in someone's life, they're not willing to acknowledge it. They're not willing to even have a conversation where they're open about it. And so you're left to kind of see the consequences that happen because of that behavior, because of that action, because of that attitude, whatever it might be. And that's a place that none of us should want to be in. And so the only way to guard against that is to reiterate what you said, have a posture of humility to say, there's a chance this person can be right. And so, you know, thank them for it. Say, you know, I may not fully understand that, but that's something I want to think about and pray about. I appreciate you bringing that up. And I think just having a humble posture in and of itself is almost always disarming, and it opens the door potentially for more healthy critique in our lives to where we're able to grow. Because again, if we knee-jerk reaction is always negative, we're going to shut that down, whether from employees or friends or whoever it is, and we're not going to get that honest feedback.
So not to jump backwards in this conversation, but the person who, and you mentioned it earlier, it's difficult for people to have that conversation. How do you become that type of friend who's willing to enter into that space to be a good influence? And essentially what I'm asking is, so how do you learn to have hard conversations with people? Because that's a big part of this being a mutually beneficial and a mutually Christ-orienting relationship.
Yeah, for sure. I not every relationship in my life is that relationship, and I don't want it to be. Honestly, I don't want to. I don't want to be the voice of critique in every single person's life. Like that's not my calling, right?
Right.
So I have some that are purpose relationships that way. And so in those relationships, we have to have the conversation before the difficult conversation is ever needed to establish what is the value of our relationship, what's the value. So like earlier I was saying, and we were using the term like define the win, define the outcome. But even in your relationship where you're saying to them, hey, I'm asking you to help me become more like Christ. So there are going to be times in the future where I'm going to have blind spots, and I want to invite you to have that conversation with me. And hopefully that's a mutual thing. So it's vice versa. And if you can establish that ahead of time, now you have the foundation to have that conversation later. So when it's time to have the conversation, I would think through what specifically you want to address. If there's something specific they just did, or it's just an overall feeling of a pathway that they're going down, then you think it through what you want to say and then have a scheduled conversation. I don't think just like springing it on people is always the best. I would say, hey, I would like to get together and talk about something, because I think just even that phraseology, people are like, oh, this is a moment, right? Versus like, hey, we're watching a movie. Oh, it's great, isn't it? Hey, I want to talk to you about something real quick. You know what I mean? Like, where all of a sudden you just like, you get the person defensive. But if they know there's going to be a conversation, and then it's just the typical thing, like sandwich it in the positive of like, here's something, obviously, you know, I love you. I mean, like set the foundation. I love you. I am not in any way trying to judge you. Here's what I see is happening that concerns me. And it concerns me for this reason. What if it violates the scripture? If I see your personality is changing, if it's having this impact. Hey, I witnessed how you were talking to your spouse the other day. I'm going to be honest, from my perspective, that felt disrespectful. That felt, and it made me uncomfortable, but I could tell by your wife's body language. You know what I mean? Like, have that purpose conversation and go, and I'm saying this because you and I, we want to become more like Christ, and this is my concern. If that person doesn't handle it well, that's on them. But again, I don't think that it is a spontaneous thing, and I think someone needs to invite you into that. So us three right now, we're all pastors in a church. We have a unique calling in our lives that we might invite ourselves into those conversations for people who attend our church, because we're the spiritual authority and leaders in the church. But if you don't have a positional authority in your life, then you have to have relational invitation to do that. So I think that's what you have to figure out. Have you invested enough in this person's life in order to be that person that can speak to them? And if not, it might not be your place to do it.
Right.
And that's where I think it can be a problem, where some people will be like, I just have the gift of confrontation. No, you're an arrogant jerk, right? Like if you're that person that feels like I'm the parking lot prophet, I have to go find people and tell them what they're doing wrong. I don't think that's biblical. I think it really does come from the context of that relational equity that you've built with them that allows you to speak. So if you haven't heavily invested in a person's life, don't be arrogant to think that you're going to be the voice of reason in their life if you don't come from, again, a position of spiritual authority.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say, is just assess the level of the relationship. If you don't have relational equity, that ultimately it's going to fall upon deaf ears, and it's actually going to probably do more harm than it is good. I would say the other thing too, I think you really touched on this, is just posture. Like, what is your posture coming into it? You know, how do you compose yourself, and what do you say? And, you know, the tone of voice that you bring. And I think all of those things matter immensely, right? The way that we carry ourselves. You know, I know you just brought it up about Chris, like you're one of the most humble people, the way that you posture yourself. If you come to me and say something 99 times out of 100, right? It doesn't even matter what it is. I'd be like, Chris, you have to be right. Like, you know, I'm just going to believe it because that's who you are, the way that you live. So I think it's important that we think about our posture. And then I would say even just the way that we view like the nature of relationships and what is loving and unloving. I alluded to this Sunday, but I do think in our society as a whole, there is something that is like, part of it's human nature, but then part of it is reinforced by our culture, that we really don't feel like we've been given permission to be able to tell anyone how to live their lives or tell anyone what to do. But I think from a biblical perspective, as Christians talking to another Christian, like if they have held themselves accountable to the standard of Christ, then it's never unloving to just ignore someone's reckless behaviors. And so I think even just reimagining what true friendship looks like, true healthy relationship looks like. And so I think that's like a big first step for a lot of people, is almost like reestablishing that vision for relationship. Because I do think so many people tend to be passive or non-confrontational in their normal mentality, that for them, the idea of having a healthy relationship just means avoiding conflict. Right. And so I think even just reimagining that to realize no, I know we've talked about this, like not all conflict has to be bad. Not all conflict has to be unhealthy. Yeah. There is such a thing as good friction, good conflict that has a healthy result. And so I think even just reimagining that as like part of my role for those who I have deep relationships with, again, relational equity, and again, people who are Christians, because we're not holding non-Christians accountable to Christian standards, right? That's wrong. And I think a lot of people do that too. Like we get frustrated that our non-Christian friends or acquaintances are not living like Christians. Well, of course they wouldn't. But if this is a person who we have a deep relationship with, they love Jesus, they've committed to follow Jesus, then we have to see it as the loving thing to do to address unhealthy behaviors.
Right. And we are in a culture that says silence is loving, but also it even goes further than that. It says that we should condone and celebrate sinful behavior in our culture. And that is the most unloving thing you could possibly do. And this is why one of the things that is really sad in our culture is even this has been now so heavily pressured to say to parents, the most loving thing you can do is allow your child to discover themselves, as if that's the loving thing to do. Let them navigate life on their own, figure it all out, because you don't want to suppress their personalities and different things. And I'm not about being abusive or like overbearing, but you're called as a parent to shape your child and to point them toward Christ and to help mold them. And they're insecure until they have someone invest in their lives to help them in that process. But that has carried over into our culture. Like it's loving to just be there to support someone as they walk off a cliff. And I'm like, it's foolish if you just use basic common sense, but it's also unbiblical. And so like, again, in love with that relational equity, you can really help someone.
I would say even as somebody who is more on the passive side of things, like I would say that's my natural tendency. Yeah. For someone who has had to learn how to love this way and to have conversations, it really is. I know I'm going to say it as strong as I mean it. It's sinful to not have those conversations.
It is.
Because you are not loving that person well. And when I say it's sinful, is essentially what you're valuing is your comfort and your security over the health of someone else.
Yeah, 100%.
And so learning how to overcome that and learning how to just essentially you're learning how to trust God in your relationships. And that's something that you work on your entire life. If you have a passive and I don't, it's not to pit one against the other or anything, but if you have a passive mindset and that's the way that you've kind of always just been, your constant work is to go, I love this person enough that I'm willing to risk this and trust God in this relationship.
Yeah. And you really are a testament to that, Chris, because I mean, so I've known you for a long time now. Initially, it was difficult for you. Yeah. And it did get to a point, it crossed over in your own mind, and that was the piece. It crossed over that you went, no, this is the loving thing to do. Right. Because you are oftentimes in your role called to have very, very difficult conversations, but you can still do it through the lens of your personality or through the bent of your personality, through kindness and humility. But yeah, I remember when you started to transition, it was like, oh, wow, it's different. I remember that with Stacy. We talk about Stacy 2.0, like, Stacy used to be real passive, and she had to learn the rhythm of that, and she became more comfortable in it. And then she started to realize, oh yeah, this isn't unloving. Right. There's nothing wrong about this. This is what love is. You just have difficult conversations. I still love the person. So like even in my role as a boss, there are times I have to have people like tough conversations. I always make sure like once I get done with the tough conversation, I just immediately turn it to relational again. And just like start talking about what's going on in your life today. What's going on? What are your plans? Because I want them to understand like this doesn't make me mad at you.
Yes,
I'm not angry. I'm not disappointed. It's like we had to talk about this thing. We're still friends. We're still fine. And then I'll make sure to relationally connect to them later on in that day. And then I'll do the same thing the next day because I want them to be so comfortable with, yes, we had a tough conversation, but we're okay. And once you learn that rhythm, you really build that trust with that person.
Confrontation is not rejection.
It's not right. It's good. Yeah. It's love. Yeah. And when you walk through it, you feel safe. I feel safer in relationships that I know people will speak the truth to me because I don't have to worry about like that I'm damaging them or that I'm doing something stupid. Like honestly, it's a much healthier when marriages can cross over. I remember as a kid hearing people say like, oh, me and my spouse can talk about anything. And I just remember thinking, even when I was early on in marriage, I was like, no. I don't know if you, were you guys that way
most
initially?
Things, but not anything.
Yeah, but like the longer, I mean, I'm going on 20, this year will be 24 years of marriage here. I mean, like at this point, literally, Mary and I can talk about anything. And it's a completely different relationship. It's so much healthier than it was when we first got married. And I'm not talking about keeping secrets. I'm talking about just being able to share your real feelings and emotions and talk about tough things. So,
yeah. Well, guys, this has been a great conversation. Anything else that you would like to leave the audience with today before we leave?
If you didn't listen to the sermon, go back and listen to the sermon. It was so well done. And I just cannot stress enough that if you want to make or break your life, it's going to be based on relationships. It was intentionally placed second in order of this series. Number one is put God first, but next to that, the most either blessing or damaging thing in your life is going to be relationships.
Yeah.
And you have to have a handful of relationships, purpose relationships in your life that are heading toward Jesus.
Yeah.
It is the mission statement of our church. We want to make disciples of Jesus Christ through purpose relationships in relevant environments. But the purpose relationships is we want to connect you with people that are walking toward Jesus, because once you develop that rhythm and that habit, it is the most powerful influence, changing force in your life that will lead you toward Christ. If you do not have those relationships in your life, you will never be the full disciple that Jesus wants you to be. It's impossible to do it. We were not designed to be lone Christians.
Amen. Well, thank you so much for listening today. And if you're looking for that message, you can just go to the Tree.Church and go to the media page, and that message should be loaded right at the top. And then we love that you're joining us and that you're desiring to grow in your faith and grow in your understanding of who God is and what He has for your life. And so thank you so much for joining us, and we pray that you'll continue to come back and engage these conversations and put them into place in your life. The practices that we talk about, the things that we're talking about, even if they're difficult, we challenge you.
Yeah.
Keep taking steps of faith, keep doing the things God's calling you to, and see if your life doesn't experience the blessing and the joy of living life according to the values that Christ has put before us. So thank you again so much for listening. We love that you joined us, and we hope to see you again next week.